All right, so you wanted us to really dig into what the future might look like for Israel and Hamas and Gaza?
Yeah.
And we are taking that request super seriously.
Okay.
Just imagine, okay, it's February 2025.
Okay.
We're just coming out of, well, not really out of it, but a ceasefire, kind of holding things together after that awful escalation back in October 2023.
Right.
And that's why we have an expert here to help us break it all down, someone who can connect all the dots and give us that so what. So welcome. I'm so glad you could join us today. Help us figure this all out.
Thanks for having me.
So we're dealing with a really critical point in time, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Understanding all the moving pieces here, it's essential if we want to get a handle on where things could be headed.
Couldn't agree more.
So let's give everyone listening a bit of a roadmap, okay? It's February 2025.
Yeah.
Just a few months after that ceasefire went into effect, and the picture that emerges from all the sources, that's pretty bleak, to be honest.
Yeah.
The region is still struggling to recover from that conflict in October 2023.
So the October 2023 conflict, it was a brutal reminder of just how deep this conflict runs. You know, we're talking decades of tension, violence. And the human cost, well, it was enormous. But the scale of destruction in Gaza, it was especially devastating.
It was.
Particularly when you consider the challenges that already existed in the territory.
Yeah, and reading through these reports is just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
The impact on civilians.
It's tough to read.
It is. It really is.
Yeah.
It's so clear that Gaza is facing a humanitarian crisis of just staggering proportion.
The conflict just made things so much worse.
Yeah.
You know, problems that were already there because of the ongoing blockade.
Right.
Years of restricted access to basic necessities.
Yeah.
We're talking widespread damage to infrastructure, shortages of essential things people need to survive, mass displacement.
Yeah.
The reports really stress how urgent it is to rebuild those basic systems.
Yeah.
Water, sanitation, healthcare. Right. Well, the ceasefire, think of it as a very temporary bridge over like a huge gap of distrust.
Okay.
It let the fighting stop, at least for now.
Yeah.
Opened a window for aid to get in.
Right.
But the underlying tensions are still there.
Yeah.
The core issues driving the conflict, those haven't gone away.
Okay.
Hamas has signaled they're willing to release the hostages they're still holding.
Okay.
In fact, they even handed over the bodies of 4 Israelis.
Really?
Yeah, including the Bibas family back on February 20th.
Wow.
And they did that as a gesture towards a permanent truce.
But I'm guessing it comes with conditions.
It does, yeah.
Okay, so what are those conditions?
No.
And how has Israel responded?
Hamas is demanding that Israel fully withdraw its military from Gaza.
Okay.
And that the blockade is lifted as part of any long-term truce.
Gotcha.
Israel, on the other hand, insists that Hamas completely disarms before they even consider those terms.
Okay.
Those positions are fundamentally at odds.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this ceasefire so fragile.
Right.
It's a stalemate.
Yeah.
Where both sides are dug in, they see their demands as non-negotiable.
It's a really tough situation to be in.
It is.
You've got a ceasefire in place, but the root problems are so deep that it feels like any wrong step could send everything crashing down.
Exactly.
And on top of all that, there are other regional and political roadblocks to consider, things that could either help stabilize things or make them a whole lot worse.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So what are some of the big ones?
Well, one major factor is Israel's continued presence in southern Lebanon.
Okay.
A lot of people in Lebanon, including Hezbollah, they view this as an occupation, which creates tension that spills over into the wider region.
Yeah.
It's like adding fuel to the fire. Makes it even harder to find a resolution in Gaza. It's all connected.
Right. And then you've got the settlements in the West Bank.
Yeah.
These policy reports really point to that as a major obstacle to any kind of peace process.
It are a huge obstacle.
Yeah. It makes it really hard to envision a two-state solution that would be acceptable to both sides.
I agree.
And that's not even mentioning the internal divisions within Israel itself on how to deal with Hamas.
Yeah, that's a big one.
So you're talking about the debate between those who want to take a hard line versus those who favor a more negotiated approach?
Exactly.
Right.
That makes it really tough for Israel to present a unified front in any potential negotiations.
I can imagine.
It's like trying to solve a complex equation when you can't even agree on what the basic math is.
Let's step back for a second and think about what all of this means, for the bigger picture.
Yeah.
You listening right now,
yeah,
what's grabbing your attention? What are you finding most troubling? Or maybe, I don't know, maybe even surprisingly hopeful in all of this?
Right.
Because even in a situation this complicated, There are always those glimmers of possibility, those things that keep us going.
Absolutely.
It's easy to get lost in just the sheer scale of the conflict.
Yeah.
But, you see these individual stories of resilience, people working so hard on the ground, pushing for peace, getting aid to those who need it.
Yeah, those are the things that remind us that change is possible.
Yeah. So where does all of this leave us?
Right.
What does this all mean for the future of Israel and Hamas?
Yeah.
Can they break free from this cycle of violence?
A history just riddled with trauma and mistrust.
Right.
It's a lot to overcome.
It almost sounds like a recipe for disaster, honestly.
Well, it could be, yeah.
Right.
But one thing I find fascinating is that these reports don't lay out a simple either war.
Oh.
Like, it's either peace or war.
Right, right.
They recognize that there's a whole range of possibilities, shades of gray between those two extremes.
Okay, now you've got me intrigued.
Yeah.
Tell me more about these shades of gray, these other potential outcomes that fall somewhere between full-blown peace and a return to all-out conflict.
Okay, so one scenario that comes up a lot is a prolonged period of relative calm.
Okay.
But not true peace,
Right.
It would be punctuated by those occasional flare-ups, those low-level clashes that never quite escalate into a full-blown war.
Okay.
But they keep everyone on edge.
Right.
The ceasefire might hold,
Yeah.
but the root causes of the conflict,
Right.
those would remain unresolved, just simmering beneath the surface.
So like a pot on the stove, never quite boiling over, but always threatening to...
Perfect analogy.
Okay.
And then there's the possibility of a more gradual, incremental improvement in relations.
Okay.
Maybe not a grand peace agreement, but a slow thawing,
Mm-hmm.
driven by things like successful hostage releases,
Right.
consistent delivery of humanitarian aid,
Okay.
those small but important confidence-building measures.
It's like a long game.
Exactly.
A slow and steady approach.
It's a process, not an event.
Right.
But of course, we have to acknowledge that things could also go the other way.
Of course.
What if the ceasefire slowly erodes?
Right.
The clashes become more frequent, more intense,
yeah.
eventually culminating in another major escalation.
Yeah, it feels like we're walking a tightrope here.
We are.
What are those key factors that will determine which path we end up on?
That's a great question, and it's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Our sources highlight a few pivotal elements.
Okay.
Internal political dynamics within both Israel and Hamas are crucial.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about the divisions within Israel, but what's happening inside Hamas is equally important.
Okay, so it's not just about Israel's internal politics. We also need to understand the power dynamics within Hamas.
Exactly.
Right.
Hamas isn't a monolithic entity.
Right.
There are different factions within the movement.
Right.
Some are more pragmatic, open to dialogue. Right. Others are more hardline, resistant to compromise.
Yeah.
Which faction ends up holding sway will really influence Hamas's approach to the ceasefire.
Okay.
And any potential negotiations.
So a power struggle within Hamas could make or break the chances for a lasting peace.
It's definitely a factor.
Right.
And then, of course, you have all the external factors.
Right, the international community.
Yeah.
Regional dynamic.
Exactly.
Okay.
How much sustained international pressure is there?
Yeah.
How effective are the mediation efforts?
Right.
What are neighboring countries doing?
Yeah, it's like a giant chessboard.
It is.
With multiple players all making moves and counter moves.
Yeah.
Each action influencing the whole game.
Exactly.
It feels almost impossible to predict the outcome with any certainty.
Well, you're right. It is very complex.
Yeah.
But just like in chess, understanding the players, their strengths and weaknesses, the moves they might make, it can help us anticipate different scenarios, inform our decisions.
It's about being strategic, thinking several steps ahead, being ready to adapt as things change.
Exactly.
Which brings us to a pretty important question.
Okay.
What are the potential implications of this conflict for the wider region?
Right.
Regardless of which path it takes.
It's a critical question, and our sources address it pretty thoroughly.
Okay.
The Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah.
It's been a focal point in the Middle East for so long.
It has.
With ripple effects that extend way beyond the immediate region.
It's like that classic analogy of a stone thrown into a pond, the ripples spreading outward.
Exactly. Right. Continued instability, or even a renewal of the conflict between Israel and Hamas, could destabilize neighboring countries.
Yeah.
Fuel extremism and radicalization.
Okay.
Exacerbate those existent tensions between different religious and ethnic groups.
Right.
It's a recipe for regional chaos. The stakes are incredibly high.
They are. And it just reminds us that we're all interconnected.
Yeah.
What happens in one part of the world can have ripple effects across the globe.
Absolutely.
It's a lot to process, I know.
It is.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah.
Explored some really complex issues, grappled with these really tough questions.
It's important to do that.